Hi, friends. My name is Edie Summers, and I wanted to ask you a question. Have you ever been through trauma? There are many different ways that people can go through trauma, and I just wanted to talk about some of the different types of trauma and some of the ways that I have found that have helped me to heal from trauma. I'm also going to specifically address trauma from domestic abuse. It is October and it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I personally have been through domestic abuse and domestic violence. It's not fun to talk about, but it's something I've experienced, and a lot of people experience it. It actually became more of a topic, even more so when COVID was around, because more people were at home. And so again, it's not a fun topic, but I am going to address that. And I also, though, wanted to talk about, we have different ways that we can experience trauma. And I think so many people today have experienced trauma in general. So whether it's from domestic abuse or domestic violence, maybe you've experienced trauma from some type of accident. I also had a ski accident in my early 20s, and I had surgery, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. And that was traumatic for me. People have been through a lot of severe weather lately, and we have a lot of different ways that people are experiencing trauma, shootings. I don't want to re-traumatize you by bringing up some of them, but I think at this point, most people have experienced trauma, and whatever, your trauma might look like, or maybe you haven't, but maybe you know someone who's experienced trauma. I want to share some of the things that I've learned that can really help. I'm sharing this from, mostly, yes, I'm a wellness expert, and I've written a book you can see here. It's called The Memory of Health. It took me 10 years to write. And I definitely talk about trauma in there and what's called traumatic resilience. I did study trauma in grad school as a wellness counseling student, or a counseling student. So we studied trauma a lot in counseling. And so I have kind of formal training with it as well. But I've also pieced together a lot of different tactics that can work. And I want to share with you one of the best things that I have found that works. And I'm going to share that with you now so that you can kind of think about it and maybe start applying it to your life. It took me a long time to figure it out. And kind of, again, reading research, reading other experts' point of views and their expertise, going to grad school, writing a book, and doing a ton of research on trauma and traumatic resilience. Now, my book also talks a lot about if you have chronic fatigue, but people can develop chronic fatigue for many reasons, including from trauma and burnout. So trauma is on the rise, burnout's on the rise, chronic fatigue is on the rise. These are all on the rise, both personally and professionally. So my book, The Memory of Health, takes a deep dive into if you have chronic fatigue for any reason, whether that's due to a chronic condition, or maybe it is from some type of traumatic event, even if it's ongoing. Some people have been through trauma one time, and it can have lasting effects. People have been to war, can develop PTSD. There's complex PTSD now too. They're always finding kind of, different ways that people have experienced, whether it's trauma or anything for that matter. The research is ongoing. So we learn new things about what might be causing trauma and also how to help it. But my number one tip to help trauma, and again, this is gathered from years and years of research and reading and my own experience, is it's having new experiences, positive experiences with people that kind of create really good memories. So, because think about it, if you've been through trauma, that's kind of a bad memory, right? That either your brain remembers or your body remembers, or both. And so it keeps getting kind of repeated, even whether or not you're aware of it, kind of on the unconscious level. So I have found the best way. Time can help too. And there are a lot of things that can help. Like creativity can help. Anything that's going to stimulate both parts of your brain is going to help. But the number one thing I have found that helps me, and also that I've seen said over and over again, although it's not said that much, but it is out there, this expertise, information, and tip, is that new positive experience that's kind of like deeply memorable can help your brain kind of rewire that situation where you're where that traumatic event lessens, and it can be you can find like create new pathways, so to speak. There's what's called neuroplasticity or brain plasticity, and part of it is related to that, is kind of creating those new positive experiences and new positive neural networks and neural pathways in your brain. And so the concept of traumatic resilience, I also studied this a lot, both in my own research and in grad school. And I put a lot of it into my book, The Memory of Health, because so many topics are tied together, right? Like, for instance, you can have trauma from having a chronic condition. Again, you can have trauma from abuse, which I'm going to go into a little bit deeper here. And I will also talk about my story of how I developed chronic fatigue. But, you know, people can develop health issues, trauma, chronic fatigue, burnout for many, many different reasons. And in traumatic resilience, the research that I read over and over again, there are several things that can help. And one of them that also pops up that is related to that main number one tip I gave you about creating those new positive experiences that kind of have like a kind of high emotional charge to them too, in a good way, right? Because it's going to help you remember that experience, almost like the same way that trauma kind of, because it's highly memorable in a not such good way, kind of sticks with you. You can also create positive new experiences with people. And so the key here is to, I know it can be hard if you've been through trauma to connect with people. That's kind of like what's hard about it too, but both in healing from trauma, that number one tip that I've been sharing that I've found, that took me a long time to find that information. It took me forever to find it because there's a lot of information out there, right, about what helps trauma. And I think a lot of it's really valid. But in traumatic resilience too, relationships are often pointed to as one of the main ways to heal. And it's about creating new positive memories, not necessarily about looking back at what's happened, and you don't want to relive it. A lot of times you can't relive it because you can't remember it, even though your brain or body still remembers it, again, on the unconscious level. So again, the number one tip that I have found through really hard-won research and insight that I think is also very, very true. And this may not be true for you in completely or for everyone completely, because again, there might be different types of different ways that you can help heal from trauma. You could try counseling. I've heard that, is it EDMR can help? So I hope I'm saying that correctly. So that's kind of like that bilateral stimulation. And there are other ways that you can also do that through, let's say, I like binaural beats. That really helps me because it kind of has like a couple beats going on at the same time. Or let's say taking a walk in nature and kind of looking from left to right or right to left. So you're kind of stimulating both parts of your brain. Those things can help too. Counseling, of course, or some type of positive relationship, because did you know, when I studied counseling, one of the things that came up over and over again there was, they have a lot of different theories in counseling about that you can focus on and specialize in when you're becoming a counselor. But one of the main threads that I saw in almost all of the theories, not all of them, but a lot of them, was that relationship that the other person is like holding space for them, the person who's in the session. And that's a huge part of what helps someone to heal. So again, that's about relationship, right? But what's really important is you want to feel safe with that other person. Positive, safe, memorable experiences with other people. That to me is the best tip that I've seen out there. And I've kind of woven that all together from, taking part of that expertise and tip that I've read and researched. Part of it comes from reading about traumatic resilience and researching that. Part of it comes from being in grad school and counseling and knowing the benefit of that positive relationship. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a counselor, right? Like a lot of coaches are now getting into mental health coaching because we have a shortage of counselors. anyone, I think, that has a lot of empathy and probably training too, but for sure empathy, and who's a really safe person could potentially be that person that holds space for you. It doesn't necessarily need to be someone who's a professional too. It could be a really good friend, family member, and they don't necessarily need to even know that they're helping you with that, right? But it does take some risk on the person who's been through the trauma to start to trust and know who to trust, know who's a safe person, know who's going to help you have those positive experiences. A lot of times it happens unplanned, right? Like you might meet people or have experiences with people and then realize that that sense of trauma feels diminished, maybe because you feel really safe in someone else's presence and you have a lot of positive experiences with them that are also memorable. So let's talk about domestic abuse, domestic violence. It's not a fun topic, but it's an important topic. It's one of the major ways that women die, and it's really important to talk about. Now, men can also be the victims of domestic abuse. It's primarily women that it happens to, and it can also happen to teenagers. But it's unfortunately happens much more often than you think. And I have personally been involved, unfortunately, in multiple abusive relationships. So I'm trying to think of which one to share with you, because there are probably two that stand out. But I think I'm going to share. So my first boyfriend was abusive. He was primarily mentally, emotionally, and verbally abusive, and took a couple months for it to kick in. And it was my first relationship ever. So I didn't realize what a relationship should look like. I didn't really know. But it became apparent to me. I didn't feel good in the relationship. And then, it became pretty clear to me at one point that it was completely dysfunctional. So I had to remove myself from that relationship. And, there can be a lot of scary moments, especially when you're talking about violence or abuse in a relationship, right? But did you know that a relationship doesn't have to be physically violent in order to be considered abusive? So I think for me, in my first relationship, I saw an ad on TV. This was a long time ago. And it was like an ad for domestic violence. And it was kind of talking about that it doesn't have to be physical in order for it to be abusive. And that's when it clicked for me that that's what I was in. And so it took a while to extract myself from that. He really didn't want to let me go. I don't think he was even in love with me. Here's the thing about abuse is it's about power and control. So, love is really not really part of the equation. Sometimes it might be, but it's if someone is trying to control you or exercise power over you, that's not about love. That's abusive. If someone is putting you down, if they're criticizing you a lot, that's abusive. Obviously, if someone's hitting you or being physically aggressive with you, I've been pinned down to the bed. I've been hit in the jaw. I've been knocked out of bed. In my first relationship, I had to lock myself in the bathroom, and he was yelling at me through the bathroom door. And I knew that if I opened that door, he would hurt me. And that's the moment that I knew that I had to get out of that relationship. And again, these can be difficult things to talk about, but I really want to share some of my experience in case it helps somebody else. So if you find yourself in a situation like this, it's really important to get a bag together, start making plans, find someone to help you on the outside. In my marriage was also abusive. And now alcohol was involved in both of these cases. These individuals were drinking alcohol, and that was definitely fueling their behavior. And in my marriage, and actually I talk a lot about my story of my experience in my marriage and how it contributed to my illness the second time around. I've dealt with what's called chronic fatigue syndrome and CFS, and I had a couple of major crashes with it. And I was actually doing much better after the first time that I developed it in my early 20s. I go into great detail in all of these stories, whether it's related to the illness that I dealt with, or the story of my marriage, and even my first boyfriend. So again, I talk a lot about wellness in my book, chronic fatigue, energy, abuse, trauma, traumatic resilience. I go into a lot of detail. I'm really into like holistic wellness, and that's what worked for me. But I was actually in my marriage, to circle back. We had gone to see a counselor, and because we were trying to work on our marriage. Now, the marriage was already abusive at this point. It was abusive early on. And again, you really want to look out for signs of power and control. Is the individual that you're involved with, are they trying to control you? Are they putting you down? Obviously, if they're physically hurting you or assaulting you or threatening you with violence, that's abuse. So we went to see a counselor, and she refused to work with him because he was under the influence of alcohol. He was under the influence of a substance. She refused to work with him, but she also helped me figure out a game plan, like a safety plan, in case I needed it. And there were many times when I would have needed that to leave. Like, we're talking about in the moment leave. Like, you want to have a bag packed, and again, work with a professional on this. And there are also a lot of like domestic violence shelters. A lot of times they should be in, I would think, in probably every city and town. Like, there are going to be resources for you. And it's, they do a really good job of protecting your privacy because people's situations are different. I personally think it's all dangerous, but there are different levels of danger. And I want to share this too. If you're involved in an abusive situation, it doesn't get better. It only gets worse. So get out earlier than later. You might think that you might tell yourself, I love this person. And you might be embarrassed. You might say, this could never be happening to me. I definitely thought that a lot, especially in my marriage. Right? Because my marriage, he kind of came on fast and heavy with me, right? Like, telling me like I was, the only woman in the world for him. And sometimes those can be red flags too. Like if someone's coming on hot and heavy in the beginning, you want to take that with a grain of salt. Sometimes that's really true. And that is really how they feel. And they're a very, legitimate, authentic individual. And sometimes that's a harbinger of things to come. That type of kind of possessive behavior can turn into abusive behavior down the road. So narcissists, I've been unfortunately involved with a lot of narcissists, and there's unfortunately a kind of a correlation between that and not having maybe any empathy or not being able to feel that empathy for someone else. And I have found that a lot of those situations involved with narcissists can turn in abusive. So it only gets worse. So get out sooner than later. I know it's not fun to extricate yourself from a situation, but you have to ask yourself what's more important, your well-being, your life, or this relationship that you think is potentially based on love, which is really based on power and control. So there's a lot more I could say about that. And it's taken me a long time to heal from those situations. And it really affected my confidence. It really affected my self-esteem. It took me years and years to build up my confidence and self-esteem and to know that I was worthy of being treated well. And to this day, I had to really work on my boundaries. And I think this is probably true for a lot of people. But think about it this way, like what was also hard for me, and I think this is also true for a lot of people, is saying to yourself that this couldn't be happening to me. There's no way that this is my reality. And there's no way that, why in the world would this person who claims to love me treat me like this? Like, and I'm so ashamed. I'm so embarrassed. Like I would never be able to tell anyone else who thinks I'm in this loving relationship, like my ex-husband and I used to be called like a power couple. And unfortunately, now there are a lot of great relationships out there, but, it is really true. Like what happens behind closed doors can be very, very different than what the veneer looks like. And so find someone to talk to, find someone to make a plan with. definitely know that you're not in it alone, and be careful. Be careful of your own safety, and put yourself first, and know that you definitely do not deserve what is happening to you. This is about the other person's behavior. A lot of times they're projecting onto you. Sometimes it could be some type of mental health disorder where, it's just completely unsafe for you to be with that person. So get your boundaries strong, make a safety plan, talk to someone, find resources. There's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. I wish I had that number for you, but it's pretty easy to look up, and they're very good at a lot of these domestic violence shelters and hotlines and websites are very, very good at protecting your privacy. So it's far better for your health and well-being and safety to reach out and get help and get out sooner than later. Don't worry about what the optics look like. Get out, but do it safely. And do it as soon as you can. So I wanted to share a little bit about, I told you I would talk a little bit about, I had developed chronic fatigue in my early 20s. And again, I mentioned that sometimes people who have been through chronic illness can develop trauma just kind of from having a chronic condition and kind of like the ongoing effects of that and being judged. A lot of times people who have these, what we call kind of invisible illnesses, chronic fatigue syndrome would definitely fall into that. There are a lot of people who struggle with health issues and wellness issues and symptoms like chronic symptoms who can experience trauma just from not being believed, that they don't feel well, and they face so many battles every day. That can be a form of trauma too. Of course, there's sexual assault and and I actually experienced that growing up, and that may have contributed to the fact that I maybe didn't understand how to have strong boundaries when it comes to relationships, maybe because I was assaulted when I was younger, sexually assaulted. And also, I want to share a little bit about, a lot of times now they're showing through the research that if you grow up with trauma, sometimes that can contribute, or even often it can contribute to health issues down the road. So now there are a lot of things you can do. And I go into great detail in my book. My book took me 10 years to write. It's called The Memory of Health. And I really take a deep dive into how to holistically kind of support your energy, how to holistically support your body, how to holistically support your heart, your mind, your body, your spirit. I definitely talk about I even talk about addiction a little bit in there. It's a comprehensive guide to well-being. There's a lot of self-care tips in there. There's a ton of research in there on chronic fatigue, trauma, traumatic resilience. I even touch upon depression in there. Did you know that depression is now considered kind of a whole body condition? And, I definitely talk about stress in there. And there are a lot of things that you can do to help yourself to heal from trauma. And there's a lot that you can do to help kind of fortify your body in terms of if you have a chronic condition too, or let's say chronic fatigue, and a lot of times, I also talk a lot about this in my book. Oftentimes what happens is we find a new normal. So whether that's you have a new normal from a chronic condition, or you have a new normal from having experienced trauma. And, there are a lot of ups and downs with it. And I know it can be really hard and really challenging to face trauma or to face a chronic condition or to face whatever like your great life, health, or wellness challenge is. I totally get it. But I think there's solace in piecing together what you can to help yourself heal. Reach out to others that feel safe to you and who feel positive to you. Safety is really important, right? Like make friends with people who kind of really have good boundaries themselves and are genuinely safe and positive people. There are those people out there, and your well-being is worth it. Your safety is worth it. There are healthy, happy people out there. And so, sometimes we have to draw those boundaries and only allow people in that have really done their own work on themselves and for whatever reason, have chosen kind of that healthy, positive path. And for some people that comes really easily. Sometimes they have a lot of support from families growing up, and other times people have to work really hard at it in order to find that path for themselves. But you deserve to be surrounded with healthy, happy people. And you deserve safety. You deserve positive experiences. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be in a happy relationship. And if you have a chronic condition, I'm personally a big fan of exploring holistic tactics, but a lot of times we have to find what works for us. And, I talk a lot about both alternative tactics and medicine in my book. And I also talk about integrative medicine and even mainstream medicine in my book. So I did a ton of research. There's a ton of research in there on all these topics and much more. My wish for you is that you find a way to heal whatever it is that you're dealing with, whether it's from trauma or a chronic condition. My hope for you is that you find that new normal, or whatever is going to be the healthiest, happiest version of you. I wish that for you. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to connecting with you more wherever you find this video. I'm on all the social media channels. You might be finding this on YouTube. Feel free to follow me on here. If you're on YouTube, you might be finding this on TikTok or Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, maybe Substack, LinkedIn. Feel free to stay connected and reach out. And for me, I have found that, holistic well-being is very, very powerful. Be good to yourself, factor your well-being in, factor yourself into your life, factor yourself into your relationships, right? Like your safety matters, your happiness matters in a relationship. It absolutely matters. If you've been through trauma, there are a lot of avenues out there to help you. My wish for you is that you find what works for you. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.